Good afternoon to everyone who has joined. I see that we've got good attendance, so we will start the program now. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on BGR's website after the event. My name is Becky Mowbray, and I am the President and CEO of the Bureau of Governmental Research. BGR is a private, nonprofit, independent research organization dedicated to informed public policy making and the effective use of public resources for improving government in the New Orleans metro area. BGR's research reports and government monitoring are hallmarks of our public policy work in Jefferson, Orleans, and St. Tammany parishes. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. If you enjoyed today's event, please consider becoming a member of BGR and supporting our work. To learn more, visit our website, bgr.org. We also encourage you to share this event on social media with others who may be interested. Please mention @BGR-NOLA in your posts. And now let's dive into today's topic. Each U.S. city has a legal framework for running municipal government that assigns authority and responsibilities. BGR views this basic governing structure, or form of government, as an important concern for citizens because it can help or hinder the ability of their elected officials to make and sustain improvements in city services and infrastructure. In this webinar, we will explore two forms of government most often found in large cities. The first is the strong mayor model, which concentrates executive authority with an elected mayor while the council functions in a legislative and oversight role. The second is the council manager model, where the council exercises both legislative and executive functions, appointing a city manager to handle day-to-day government operations and advise on policy. New Orleans follows the strong mayor model, which is established in the city's home rule charter. But as many of you know, voters adjusted the city's strong mayor format last fall when they passed a charter amendment to require the city council to confirm the mayor's appointments of department heads. While some, including BGR, viewed this as a limited change, adding significant transparency to the appointment process, others criticized the amendment as usurping the mayor's power. Mayor Cantrell objected to the amendment and urged any reconsideration of the city's form of government to be done in the context of a full review of the Home Rule Charter. BGR has no current position on any possible future changes to the city charter. However, our report on the recent charter amendment raised questions among members of the public about the city's form of government and the implications of those choices. Because of that interest, BGR put together this webinar. To lead us through this important discussion, we are honored to have three experts in the field. Our first speaker will be Jered Carr. He is a professor and the outgoing head of the Department of Public Policy, Management, and Analytics at the University of Illinois Chicago's College of Urban and Public Affairs. His research on local government has been published in a wide range of journals in public administration, political science, and urban affairs. Our second speaker today is Kimberly Nelson, another leading national expert on the topic of municipal governance. She is a professor of public administration and government at the University of North Carolina School of Government. Her research on form of government, corruption, and innovation has been published in several academic journals. Our final speaker will be David Marcello, adjunct professor and executive director of the Public Law Center at Tulane University Law School. Among his accomplishments, he chaired the 1994-95 advisory committee that undertook the only comprehensive revision of the New Orleans City Charter since its 1954 launch. David also served as executive counsel to New Orleans Mayor Dutch Morial. BGR thanks each of our three speakers for the insights they gave us during preparations for this webinar. We hope you had a chance to read our companion primer to become more familiar with today's topic. You can find the link to the primer in your webinar invite, and it is also available in our report library at bgr.org. So let's get started. We welcome Jered Carr to the Zoom screen. Following our speakers' presentations, we will have time for questions from the audience. Webinar attendees can submit a question by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom center of your screen. Just type your question in the box that appears and hit return. Jered, thank you tremendously for joining us today. The webinar floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to lead us off. And I have a short presentation designed to provide a quick and basic introduction to the topic. I think it will help set up the remarks of the other speakers and should be helpful for Q&A. So let me go and pull this up now. Beginning, there you go. And so the slides are a little bit wordy, but I intend for them to be used as a resource that BGR can share. All right. So as was already noted, right, I'm focusing on the two general forms, mayor council, often called strong mayor, and the council manager, often called reform government because it emerged as a progressive era alternative to the mayor council form. And then what I'll do is I'll introduce both of these forms very quickly in one slide each, and then turn to a really short discussion thinking about the way these two different forms incentivize different benefits. It can also be a way of thinking about the potential impact that specific proposals to change a form of government might affect performance. So the basic idea of mayor council, I think, is pretty familiar to us. This idea of separation of powers that's based on the same structure as the national government, with the elected mayor as chief executive officer, responsible for managing executive agencies, with a city council as legislative branch, responsible for authorizing revenues and expenditures. So note that this separation creates independent and often competing centers of executive and legislative power in government, right? And it's intended to do so. And we often think of separate branches of government, if you will, but we don't always remember that they're competing as well, or at least potentially competing. So this shared power structure is expected to reduce tyranny and promote accountability, right? If you remember thinking back what the initial structure was designed to do was prevent elected officials from amassing too much power. And then it's also the basis for this focus often that we talk about in terms of strong mayors, right? So we're very focused on the strength of the mayor relative to the council. And oftentimes we think of it as zero sum. Council manager form, this also too, I think, is somewhat familiar outside of a governmental context, right? Where the council has executive and legislative responsibility with this unification of power structure. The council appoints manager to serve as the chief executive officer and have responsibilities for managing the operations of the government. So this unification of power structure is thought to reduce conflict among elected officials over what you would have had with a division of power structure. And then it also permits the appointment of a chief executive officer based on management experience, right, rather than the ability to win elections as with an elected mayor. And as I noted earlier, the council manager structure emerged as an alternative to the mayor council with a strong emphasis on administrative capacity. So when we're thinking about it, we're often thinking about its relative advantages and limitations over the mayor council structure. All right, so so I offer up this kind of political administration dimension to provide a lens for thinking about fundamental differences in the operational values underlying these two forms. It's not a perfect way for thinking about differences in these governments, but I find it useful. So in this context, we would say we think of the values emphasized by the very basic mayor-council form as the importance of elected political leadership and a process for decision-making that is open to the political environment and creates opportunities for involvement by the public, especially organized interest, right? So this is this idea of it being inclusive and competitive. It's a decision-making process that, because it operates through politics, brings in different perspectives. And this is how we traditionally think of government operating in this country, right? But on the other hand, the values emphasized by the basic council manager form are the importance of administrative leadership, working with political leadership to create a decision-making structure or a process that is open to the political environment, but is also somewhat insulated from day-to-day politics, and creates something of a division of responsibilities that leaves broader policy questions to elected officials and applying non-political expert knowledge to implement these policies to non-elected administrators, right? So again, this description is a bit simplistic, but I think it does give us a lens for how we might think about fundamental differences in the two forms. So most cities, right, are in the middle in the sense that they don't seek one or the other, but they seek both of these values in their government. And so their structures are more nuanced than these simple descriptions suggest. So the last two slides that I have outline some provisions that can be adopted by governments that can affect how the government achieves values of political accountability and administrative competence. And in part, I'm setting up the next two speakers because I think they'll touch on some of these same provisions in their discussion. Okay, so here are the three major categories of these potential provisions that impact this question. As I said, I'll leave a detailed discussion of them to others, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into Q&A. But clearly the provisions in the third group, right, those that allocate administrative authority among these three key actors in the government are especially salient to the topic today. And then you can also think of it this way. This is the last slide, and what it attempts to do is put a little bit of direction on some of the potential effects of these provisions. And to some extent, when you're looking at this probably fits within people's idea of a strong mayor, right? As you can see, the issues are how these provisions expand the authority of the council and or appointed CEO, and the issues that we may think of as the province of an elected executive officer. So really quickly, before I turn this over to Kim Nelson, I just wanted to mention that these provisions are used in municipalities around the country, but not every government has the power to adopt them, right? States may be limited in the options available to municipalities, that the municipalities in their own states. And also some of these provisions may be bundled into specific types of governments, home rule, charter, for example. And so again, local discretion in terms of adopting some of these may be reduced. And then finally on that, let's not forget the importance of organizational culture, norms of the office, and a working relationship among the various actors is really important in terms of how performance of these governments is achieved. And so with that, I turn it over to Kim, and I believe I stopped the share and step off. Thank you.
Thank you, Jered. Good afternoon, everyone. So I am going to be building on some of what Dr. Carr has presented to you. Let me see if I can get this to show the slides. Okay, great. So I also have been following along with some of your questions that are coming up, and I will be addressing parts, at least, of some of those questions in my presentation. And so if you have other questions, of course, in the Q&A, or if I didn't cover it well, you can bring it up then. So the first two slides I have are somewhat of a review of what Dr. Carr provided, but in a little more detail. And this is generally what we see in the United States. And the United States is especially unique in the world in that we have such diversity in our local government form and structure. And so there aren't a lot of generalizations we can make nationally, but we can make some. And so what we see, again, I'm not going to go through all of these because Dr. Carr already covered it, for example, the underlying principles. But you can see that the one of the biggest distinctions between a council manager and a mayor council is that a mayor is always elected in a mayor council form at large, and in a council manager form, the mayor is usually elected at large today, but about a third are selected by the council. So it's a little bit different in that respect. The removal of the mayors is essentially the same, except in some council manager form, the mayor can be removed by the council. Again, for the CEO, who in the council manager form would be the manager, that person can be removed without cause at any time. They do have a contract typically, and there are contract provisions for severance and that sort of thing, but they're all at-will employees. Mayor is usually not a member of council, and I'll give you some data in a little while to show you some of these things that Dr. Carr talked about and how they play out across the country, numbers-wise. And you can see on this slide is the continuation of that. Again, I'm going to provide some data in your New Orleans population range in a bit to show you just how this plays out in practice. But generally, in a mayor council form, generally the mayor appoints the CAO, the manager. Often the council has to approve that appointment, but not always. And then you see department heads also, mayor usually with or without council confirmation. Policy development, the mayor is not generally a member of council in the mayor council form. And so the role is a little bit different with how policies are proposed on the mayor's side. And you'll get these slides so you can see these in detail. If we look at what do we see across the country in our largest cities in the United States, we can see the mayor council form is found in the very, very, very largest cities in the United States, although it's expressed quite differently. So a New York mayor has a lot more power than a Chicago mayor, for example. And then we see council manager form also in some of the largest cities. They tend to be in the large Sunbelt cities. As far as New Orleans population range, what do we see? And I keep this a massive data set of all cities in the United States of populations 10,000 and above, and I update it every year. And it's a living data set. And it's very accurate, and this is where this data comes from. So if we look at the population range in New Orleans is in 33 cities fall into that population range. Mayor council is 18, 11 with a chief administrative officer of some type, and 15 have council manager form. As far as the size of council, I know someone asked about that. There's really no rules about this. This is, again, the United States, we're an eclectic country. And so we see the size varies from very small, 5 to 26. So great deal of variability. The most common size, 7 and 9 are tied. This is for either form of government. There is no pattern as far as form of government, which one has a larger council. And then in the mayor council form, what we see there are of those 18, 12 are all district elections and 6 are mixed district and all at-large elections. I think as far as the size of council too, the ones that are on the very large size tend to be consolidated city counties. So they're representing both the city and the county government. As far as mayors go, so here's the data, some data on the mayors. And we can see I am divided by mayor council and council manager systems. And this is some of the stuff that Jered talked about, the full-time versus the part-time mayor. So more mayor council mayors are full-time than council manager mayors. Mayors, about a quarter still preside in the mayor council form. So that may be kind of surprising, but all of them generally preside in the council manager form. And of course, this is only in this population range. The data is different when we put all of the cities in the United States in, but not too dissimilar. The mayor does not vote very often in a mayor council form, but still close to a quarter in both forms vote for a tiebreaker. And then we see that all mayor council mayors in this size do have veto power, whereas only 27% in council manager form do. As far as the appointment of the CAO, 67% either have the mayor do the appointment or the mayor with council approval, and 61%, same thing, mayor or mayor with council approval appointing department heads. And then 56% have budget formulation authority. I don't know why my slide's choosing not to slide. Okay, and as far as, and here's a little bit more on some other authority. So I broke it down for the appointment of the CAO, 67% of the mayor alone, 25% of the mayor with approval council, 8% just council. As far as department heads, 61% the mayor, independent of council, 11% mayor with approval of council. And this is only mayor council form. And 11% is tied that the CAO in the mayor council form is actually making these appointments of department heads. In New Orleans, the CAO has a significant role in these appointments in consultation with the mayor. And then 11% is other. So in some parts of the country, we actually have boards or commissions that make appointments of department heads, particularly police and fire. And then budget, we see 56%. The mayor formulates the budget and presents it to council. 28%, it's a mayor sharing with CAO. Often the CAO is responsible for communicating to the departments, putting it all together. The mayor reviews it and then brings it to council. And then 11%, the chief administrative officer. And in this case, although the chief administrative officer formulates it, the mayor still may do the formal presentation, but the mayor's not involved in the formulation. And then 6% other. In some places, actually, council committees formulate the budget, so it's a little bit different. The CAO, just as a role in a mayor council government, typically works at the direction of the mayor. So the mayor is responsible for overseeing the CAO and, often hires and fires them, as you saw. They also, in many cases, the charters or ordinances require hiring based on professional qualifications. And I can share excerpts with you of what some other charters say. A few, like Atlanta, are very, very specific as far as what, Atlanta requires a graduate degree. It requires a minimum number of years of experience for the CAO. And so it's very specific in what they want in the CAO. So that limits the mayor's authority a little bit, right? Because the mayor can't just appoint his campaign officials or something. And what makes the city a true hybrid? So there are a few places in the United States that are true hybrids. And this isn't what Dr. Carr was talking about. This is when we lose an ability to identify whether there's still separation of powers or whether there's unification of powers. And this is not just a matter of giving a council manager mayor veto or giving a mayor council mayor a tiebreaker on council. It's more significant than that. And it takes a lot of study to understand which ones are like this. But what ends up happening is we lose a balance in roles, and it tends to cause some problems and issues. And so it's not something that I would recommend going full into a hybrid. So why do cities consider changing their form of government? So first of all, there's not a lot that say we're going to completely change our form this year. A handful change every year, actual form of government. In some states, they're actually required to change their form of government when they hit a certain population level, because only certain types of government are allowed to have certain forms. In other cases, they make a lot of minor changes. So in some states, cities are required to have convene charter commissions every so many years. And so they generally end up making some small changes each time. The reasons we see wholesale change in form of government are often precipitated by some major event. So a huge corruption scandal, like in Dixon, Illinois, the Kelo decision in New London, Connecticut, those sorts of things are precipitating events that led to changes in form of government. There's also a pattern of charismatic mayors who are seeking greater power and authority. And this is generally when it's a council manager form, seeking to become a mayor council form. So mayors are often the leaders behind these changes that we see. And again, if you're required to convene a charter commission by state law, you're more likely to change your form of government. I have a lot of research on form of government and how it may affect performance. The one thing I will say is that there's no magic bullet, right? In my opinion, the council manager form is more likely to lead to success and less likely to problems than the mayor council form. However, there are some very, very successful mayor council forms of government in the United States. And so any form of government can work well if the right people are in office. And there isn't a lot of data that says absolutely this one form of government is always going to work no matter what. There really isn't anything to tell us that. As far as the accountability question, in government, accountability is derived from 4 sources: the law, transparency, oversight, and professional standards. In the council manager form, you have all 4 of those. In the mayor council form, it's a little harder to have transparency and oversight. And so we do see greater levels of corruption in the mayor council form than in the council manager form. And finally, a few extra points about form. No form provides mayor with overall full policymaking authority, independent counsel. Emergency powers in all forms of government do not allow our mayor to make policy change independent of council unless it's previously delegated through a charter or through an ordinance. I don't like the term weak mayor. I'm not crazy about the term strong mayor either. I think a mayor in any form of government can be politically strong and quite successful and very good for their government, no matter what form of government they're under. But to me, there's no such thing as a weak mayor. It's maybe a weak personality, but I still wouldn't say that to them. But I do not think there are really weak mayors in the United States. And then the National Civic League does a model city charter in which it endorses a certain form of government. It has endorsed the council manager form for many years now. And with the latest iteration passed last year, it also recommends that the mayor be popularly elected versus selected by council. And now I'm going to turn it over to David. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Kim. And thanks, let me say, to Becky and everyone at BGR for putting this event together. We hope it'll prove productive. I don't have any PowerPoint slides. I may have some props to pull up here from time to time, but let me begin by simply presenting the frame for these remarks. And in doing so, I'm drawing upon this nation's singular contribution to philosophy, American pragmatism. Here is my pragmatic message and mantra. Charter reform is not worth doing unless it's doable. We're not looking for a chautauqua, some sort of a chat session. We're looking for achievable change. So let's keep that frame in mind as we consider where to go with a variety of charter reform ideas. I intend to talk about 3 things. First, the charter reform process, how the work gets done, the legal procedure. Secondly, charter reform history, what has worked in the past and why or why not. And then thirdly, charter reforms. What are our objectives? What do we seek to change? So beginning with the charter revision process itself, you'll find it in the Home Rule Charter at section 9.201. It's entitled 2 Methods of Amendment. And the first of these is what I would characterize as the traditional charter revision approach. It's been there since the 1954 charter. It starts with either an ordinance passed by the city council that puts a proposition on the ballot, or a petition signed by anywhere from 10% to 10,000 voters, whichever is fewer. And likewise, that petition has the capability to put a charter proposition on the ballot. In either event, whether it gets there by council ordinance or by a voter petition, the definitive step is an election. It needs voter approval by a majority of the votes cast. So that's the traditional method of charter revision. There's a second procedure that we created new in the 1994-95 charter revision process. It originates with a mayoral executive order. It might fairly be described as executive branch reorganization. It can't change 6 offices in city government: the mayor, the CAO, law, police, fire, and civil service. But other Article 4 executive branch entities can be renamed, reassigned powers, consolidated, subdivided, reorganized, or abolished via mayoral executive order. The procedure is for this order to go to the city council for review and comment. The council gets a yes or no vote, up or down, no opportunity to amend it. If there is no council vote, then the proposed changes in the executive order become effective 60 days later. So what we're probably considering primarily in today's session is the traditional method of charter revision found in the 1954 charter. So second topic, the history of charter revision. And I'm not going to go back to 1954 because our focus today is on much more recent years. What works when it comes to charter revision and what doesn't? Well, we've got, I'm going to be drawing on my comments here in an article that I did in this publication. The article is entitled Legal Origins and Evolution of Local Ethics Reform in New Orleans. But you don't have to have this book to access the article. And I'm not recommending that you all run out and access it, but I want to share a research tip that I think is very useful for people who have an interest in government. And that is the Social Science Research Network. If you haven't heard of it yet, go to ssrn.com. It is where old law review articles go to gain new life. Pretty much after they've been published in a hard copy, they and a host of other things, not just law review articles, get posted at ssrn.com. So again, you can find any author's articles there by the name of the author and by the subject matter, ssrn.com, a great resource. So let me talk about 4 test cases on what works in charter reform. And they span 4 mayoralties, Moon, Dutch, Sidney, and Mark. The first of those by Moon was in 1975. He tried charter revision, didn't succeed. Dutch tried it twice in 83 and 85. Neither one succeeded. Sidney tried it in 1981, also did not succeed. So Mark Morial in 94, 95 did have success with it. We're going to look in a minute at why and how that was. But why did those 3 mayoral administrations fail in their charter revision efforts? Well, a variety of reasons, but one that spans all 3 of them is they were, in my opinion, too late. Every one of those 3, Moon, Dutch, and Sidney, attempted it in their second term as mayor. By contrast, Mark appointed his charter revision advisory group in the first 6 months of his term and asked for their recommendations by the end of that calendar year. So he got a much earlier start. Moon's 1975 Charter Reform Commission proposals never reached the ballot. Dutch's 2 in 83, that was for an unlimited period of time to serve as mayor, unlimited terms. And then in 1985, just 1 more term as mayor, both rejected by the voters. And that gives us another lesson aside from being a little too late in a mayor's term, and that is don't let charter reform acquire political overtones. That charter reform effort was perceived as an opportunity to extend the mayor's term in office. The voters did not approve it. And then the Bartholomew Commission appointed in 1991, the proposition went on the ballot in 1993, the last year of Sidney Bartholomew's service as mayor. And there were 4 separate ballot propositions. Interestingly, the BGR supported propositions A and D, opposed B, and took no position on C. Does this suggest another key to success in charter revision? Get the BGR support? Well, it certainly doesn't hurt. And in fact, Mark Morial had the BGR support, but I don't think, apologies, Becky, that was the whole reason why the Morial initiative succeeded. Why did it happen? Well, again, it was an early start. He stepped off briskly after taking office. Moreover, Mark and a number of the people that he ran against for mayor all campaigned on the need for charter reform. So there was a public and political groundwork laid for taking up this important business after the administration arrived. It went on the ballot as a single proposition. Don't get complicated. It avoided some hot button issues. In his very first meeting at Gallier Hall with the Charter Committee, Mark Morial identified several items that ought to be left untouched, in his opinion. One was the basic structure of government, a mayor and council with 5 district and 2 at-large council members. We decided at that time and place not to try to reconsider that. 2-term limits on the mayor and council were left alone. Road use and real property service charges were prohibited in the charter. We decided to leave those alone. And no one was interested in taking up one land-based casino. So those were the 4 that were kind of put to the side. But more importantly, Mark championed a number of first-time reforms in city government. He had campaigned on the creation of an Office of Inspector General. And in fact, the charter revisions accomplished that. We went a bit further with an ethics review board. There was a Bill of Rights, and for the first time, competitive selection of professional services. There was also a diverse charter committee. The 54 committee had 12 members. They were all white, mostly male, except for Martha Robinson. We had a much more diverse group. So thirdly, charter objectives going forward. Let me draw a distinction at the outset between specific reforms. Becky has already given us an example of one of those, the November 22 ballot initiative requiring council approval of mayoral appointees. Those single shot specific reforms are easier to accomplish than comprehensive top to bottom charter reform. So 3 other things that people might consider as single shot charter reform objectives. Possibly delivering the proposed budget from the mayor to the city council a month earlier. Instead of November 1, let it happen on October 1 and give a full 60 days for council consideration. Secondly, unite the legislative and executive branch procedures for procuring professional services competitively. And thirdly, consider increasing funding for the Office of Independent Police Monitor and the Office of Inspector General, both of which perform important watchdog functions. So I'm going to return in closing to my opening comment from American pragmatism. Charter reform is not worth doing unless it is doable. I hope we can come to some conclusions in the Q&A about what things might or might not make sense to launch in the current environment. Thank you, Becky.
Fantastic. Thank you, David, for your very insightful presentation. That was really helpful. I would like to thank all 3 of our panelists for taking the time out of their schedules to speak with us today and for preparing these very informative presentations. Jered and Kim, I'm glad you're rejoining me on the Zoom screen for the Q&A portion of our agenda. We hope that our speakers' presentations have gotten our audience members thinking about this important topic, and we look forward to answering some of your questions. There are a ton of them that have come into the chat. Webinar attendees can submit a question by clicking the Q&A icon at the bottom center of your screen. Just type your question into the box that appears and hit return. Okay, we're going to try to get as many of these questions in as possible. Okay, let's see. We'll start with, okay, from Brad Wellens, is there a way of measuring efficiency to compare the 2 forms of municipal governance? Does one form or another seem to be more effective? Maybe in terms of avoiding the political fights that we seem to have a lot of here in New Orleans these days. Anyone?
I can start. So Jered and I have had this discussion before that each city, each population has a specific culture, as he mentioned, and part of that culture is an expectation of what citizens expect from their government and what they're willing to pay for those services. And so efficiency is in the eye of the beholder, essentially. It's very difficult to say one community is more efficient than another because one community, the citizens may choose a very high level of services, and that costs a lot of money. And so they're willing to pay more per capita than another place would be willing to pay for because they want lower levels of services, or they're not willing to pay for that level of service. And so they want as much as they can get for that amount of service. But when you start comparing cities, the difficulty as far as efficiency goes is determining, what the level of services compared to what they're paying. And then you also have sort of economic considerations. Different regions are more expensive than other regions. Some cities are required to offer education services, school districts, whereas they're separate in other places. And so it's really difficult on the efficiency question. Jered, do you want to add something?
Yeah, sure I can. I mean, I agree with everything you said, Kim. It ends up being a fairly complex, challenging thing to work through. But I think I also heard a little bit about kind of political conflict in there as well, right? And so I would also suggest part of that is thinking about the political conflict that exists in the community in terms of the kinds of issues, right, and the kinds of things that are going on. And so one thing I would say, I've always thought about this, is one of the potential strengths of a mayor council form is the ability to deal with kind of political conflicts over different priorities within the community, and be able to do that through more of this kind of a political process. Whereas council manager form, often we think of it as operating where there are less kind of really significant conflicts that have to be sorted out by the elected officials. I don't know if that helps, but.
Very much so. Kim, you have done a lot of research on corruption and form of government. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so for our first study, we looked at corruption convictions in U.S. municipalities from 1990 to 2000. And we recently increased the data to 2010. And in both cases, with different statistical analysis and different controls, we're finding that the number one factor that leads to lower risk of a corruption conviction is having the council manager form of government. And so it really what we see is that, and the current study we're doing is going to be a book, and we're going to go into some details about what other factors may be at play there and what's going on. And really, we see two different, in our opinion, based on prior research and our own research, we really think that the council manager form has incentives in place, which Jered alluded to, that are based in professionalism and a code of ethics. And that professionalism helps the manager generally be able to take a more critical look at for example, financial documents, as well as to choose staff who are savvy in things like internal controls. And we also believe that there is a lower opportunity for those political incentives that are at play as in a mayor council form and council manager. There's less opportunity for access to a politician who has independent authority. So, and the council manager form, the mayor and council share authority. And so a developer, for example, which is really a common way that corruption occurs, goes to approach a person for some sort of variance or something. And in a council manager form, they have to go to professional staff to do so. But in the mayor council form, they also often approach elected officials for that.
I'm keying off a question that's in the chat that kind of came up in discussion, so I'm taking it a slightly different direction. You guys mentioned that some governments they review charters because they have a requirement to review them at a regular interval. For the three of you, do you think that's a good idea or not? I know Jefferson Parish, for example, does it every decade. In Orleans, we have no such requirement. Do you think that's a good thing to have a review, like required review, or not?
Maybe that's a start for David, perhaps.
I tend to think charter revision has its season, and it's not necessarily predictable on a 10-year, 5-year, 20-year period. A lot of things have to come together in government: personalities, public and political perceptions of need. Certainly in our city's history, Katrina proved to be a thought-provoking moment, and it's not unusual for natural disasters to lead to a political upheaval. So a periodic review is certainly a very decent idea, but I don't know whether I would say every 10 years you've got to find some aspect of your charter to amend. It might need to be done sooner than that, or it might not need it on such a predictable schedule.
Thank you.
Can I add one thing real quick? Sure. Sorry, Becky. So when you look at this nationally, what you do see, though, is that places that are required to convene these charter commissions frequently are end up with sometimes very confusing charters because they keep adding on, and it's not like taking a really comprehensive look at the entire charter and really rethinking. And so that can become inefficient in my opinion.
Very good.
Right. Louisiana has a constitution that is sort of demonstrating that principle. We periodically tack a few new amendments into it until we get tired of an expanding document and figure it's time to rewrite it.
Okay. Many would argue that separation between the legislative and executive branch is good because it provides checks and balances. How are such safeguards ensured in the city manager council form of government? Jered, do you want to jump in on that one since
sure, I can start a little bit, and also maybe Kim can add, because I think that the thing that I would start is kind of ask what the benefits of the checks and balances are, right? Kind of what are you protecting against, right? And if you think about it as a separation of power, going back to kind of the classic way of thinking about our national government as to protect against the amass of power and ability to do things in the interest of preventing tyranny, right? I mean, that's good if you're not going to prevent tyranny, but it also has some cost to it as well, right? In terms of actually be able to move things forward, right? I mean, you only have to look at our national government right now to see some of the challenges that separation can create. I've got some ideas on the other, but I could leave that to Kim. I think is a little more of an expert on it.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that when you get these true hybrids, you see problems with the checks and balances are one of the key issues you have. And I think that in a council manager form, the manager and staff are held to account every single time there's a council meeting. They have to report to council. They have to stand and submit to questions and answers. They are taking direction, very specific direction on policy options from the council. And so there's a lot of checks on it. So even though they've delegated administrative authority to a manager, that person could be fired at any time and knows it. And therefore, they are hyper aware of staying accountable to council, but not just that. Their code of ethics demands that they always serve the public interest. And so they are also considering what's best for the public. And although this may be tough for a manager, if the council is making a policy decision that the manager truly believes in his or her professional opinion to be against the interests of the public, that person is obligated by their code of ethics that they swear to not implement that, and to if they can't implement it, they can't work there, of course. But it's a very for managers who and many managers do take this very seriously, this obligation to always work for the public interest. And I think that you don't necessarily see that in some mayor councils.
Yeah, could I add back onto that again too? Sure. Just because it is important, right? Is when you're thinking about it, that you're often thinking about this accountability relationship between the elected council, the manager, and the public, right? So it's shaped up into, it creates a little bit of a different type of thing. And as Kim pointed out, not only kind of code of ethics, but other employment opportunities, et cetera. Your whole reputation is based on this. And one of the things that happens in the council manager, right, is you have to spend a lot of time kind of socializing and creating an environment so that there's kind of accountability within the roles of the elected council and the manager, right? So a lot of time too is kind of spent in kind of working out the nature of that relationship.
Super. Going back, we've got so many awesome questions in here. Okay, here's a couple kind of comparing the balance of one versus the other. Historically, the form of government in New Orleans has been very mayor-centric, with the mayor having considerable power. Would a city manager model automatically strip the mayor of power, or are there forms of city manager governments that retain robust mayoral role/power on the council?
So I can start. The mayor, as I said, in my opinion, there's no such thing as a weak mayor. So a mayor in a council manager form doesn't have independent executive authority as they would in a strong mayor form like New Orleans. But the mayor serves a very important role as essentially the leader of council. The mayor has to build consensus among the other elected officials. The mayor works most directly with the manager on, what's happening on the agenda, setting the agenda for the council. And so mayors and some mayors in council manager form do have veto power. Some mayors in council manager form do have a stronger role in the appointment of the manager. I wouldn't recommend a full appointment of the manager in a council manager form going to the mayor, but you can give the mayor a little more formal authority. But generally, I can't state enough how important it is for a mayor in a council manager form to be strong politically, strong interpersonally, and be able to build relationships and facilitate the governance process. It's a critical role in the council manager form.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of the option of having the mayor appoint the CAO with council consent? Would it add accountability, or would it shift the city into a problematic governance situation?
I'd say at some level, it depends on the basic relationships between the mayor and council as a starting point, right? So at a minimum, right, it obviously kind of reduces the kind of the independent authority of the mayor, in that you're having to share this kind of a process in terms of kind of approving the CAO. But at the same time, it probably depends on just how good and the nature of the relationship between the council and the mayor. So it doesn't have to be a significant problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No, another factor is that mayors are probably never at as strong a position as the day that they take the inaugural oath. And so the odds are good at the outset of a mayoralty that the person you would like to have as CAO is going to pass muster, unless there's some really deep political divide or performance problem associated with the nominee.
I would just say, I would just say that the sharing the appointment authority is less important than sharing the firing authority.
Sure.
So I would think if the council is given a very strong role in the ability to fire the CAO, that makes the CAO, just think, any of you know this, right? Whoever can fire you is a very important person in your life. And so that right. becomes, that means you're more accountable to the council than to the mayor if the council is the one that can fire you, right? So that's the area that I think is more popular.
Right. Okay. I'll just add one, because this actually goes back to the other question too a little bit, is as we're talking about, kind of a council manager system or a mayor council. Don't forget that if you move toward that council manager system, it's also very important in terms of the nature of the council, right? That the functionability of that council also becomes very important. So we're thinking about, well, what does the mayor lose? But at the other time too, you also have to be thinking about kind of what this means for the council and the council's ability to function well. And certainly when you look at council manager cities, a critically important part is just how functional that council is.
Okay. In New Orleans, our civil service system is in the Louisiana Constitution. We have lots of political subdivisions that play important roles in the city, and there are 108 boards and commissions. Would these factors limit the potential impact of a city manager form of government?
Are you suggesting that who appoints these? I mean, is that the nature of the issue?
Just the idea that there are a lot of things that are controlled kind of outside of City Hall that sort of
Sure.
that affect government.
Yeah, and so it might be worse in this particular case, right? But in every community, right, there's going to be some boards and other kinds of governmental units that are operating there that are outside of the authority of City Hall.
Some years ago, a colleague here at Tulane and I did a New Orleans satellite government database, and it tried to compile in one location all of those diverse governmental entities, but that are not necessarily immediately controlled by the city itself. And I think we calculated that it was anywhere from a third of the revenues of the city theoretically available to the city of New Orleans that were actually controlled by these other enterprises. And they perform useful functions, some more useful than others perhaps, but there's a lot to be said for the work that gets done by those enterprises. But more on accountability, I want to make a pitch for one of the principal accountability mechanisms. Kim, I think your remarks alluded to it, and that is transparency. I mean, it's absolutely vital that whether you are the beating heart of city government itself, or whether you are one of these satellite entities, the open meetings and public records laws that subject all of the meetings and documents to public disclosure are a hugely important component of accountability. The public cannot hold government accountable for what it cannot see. And so those transparency laws are the vehicle for making visible what happens.
Super. New Orleans is a majority Black city, and many would argue that the mayoral form of government has reflected this reality over time. So citizens may want to know whether we see much diversity, gender, racial, ethnic, socioeconomic background, career experience when it comes to city managers. What are the chances that if New Orleans went to a city manager system, that it would be able to find a city manager that reflects the population of the city?
That's a great question. And, just remember that you would still have a mayor if you were, and I'm sure it would be a popularly elected mayor if you ever considered going to the council manager form here. This is something, and quite honestly, the profession has not done well attracting minorities to the top positions in management. Now, we see much more diversity in assistant manager positions than we do. And this is not just racial diversity, it's gender diversity as well, into the top jobs. The profession has been working very, very hard to attract people of color and more women to the profession. But yes, we have a long way to go. Are there some extremely successful minority managers in the country? Absolutely. And there are more and more every day, women and people of color. And but we still have a long way to go.
Just to add to that, right? It's a pool issue, certainly part of it, but let's not forget too that the council would hire this person, right? And if that was important to the council and their voters, then certainly it would be something that could be stressed. And certainly it would be an important, highly visible position that you can imagine gravitating to. And I know you don't have a whole lot of time, but a lot of this stuff is talked about the creation of a council manager form. It's almost a question for Kim, is how often do you see cities completely change form that are the size of NOLA? And that's almost back to what David said early on about doing things that are doable.
Okay. I'm trying to sneak one more.
Here at Tulane, we have a School of Professional Advancement and a Master's of Public Administration. I'm actually going to be in a panel with a number of the students in that program next week. So the university is being responsive to a need.
I'm going to try to squeeze one more in.
I answered that in chat, by the way, how many. So you can, or in the question answers, I typed.
Thank you. In cities where voters have changed the form of government, either from mayor council to council manager or vice versa, what do we know about the short and long-term effects of those shifts? Have cities generally improved after the change?
The short answer is no. There's very little data to support changing form of government. Has had huge changes in the way the government has performed in those places. Like, as I said, sometimes it's a reaction to an event like the Kelo versus City of New London, where New London, Connecticut was the subject of a Supreme Court case that allowed eminent domain for economic development purposes, and they changed the entire government. They got rid of every single person and their form. In Dixon, Illinois, they had commission form of government. They were the subject of the largest municipal embezzlement in history, birthplace of Ronald Reagan, and they subsequently changed the council manager form after that. And so we see those big changes, and then we see places like Oakland and San Diego and Richmond that had very powerful mayors who, in a weak mayor system, as you would say, who were able to get the form of government changed so that they could have greater power. And in larger cities, these mayors want this authority so that they can use it as a jumping off point to higher elected office.
It pains me to say that I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions today, because there are so many good ones in the chat. Thank you, Jered, Kim, and David, for sharing your time and knowledge with us. And thank you to our audience for participating today. I hope the discussion highlights, here we go. I hope the discussion highlights the importance of clear information and citizen engagement with regard to considering any future changes to our city's governing structure. Voters should be educated and involved in any future discussions about this topic. We will be uploading a recording of this webinar to accompany the companion primer on our website at bgr.org. The best way to stay on top of all BGR events and research is to become a member. We regularly engage with our members about our public policy work, and we value this dialogue. We also rely on our members to help amplify BGR's policy recommendations. If you're not currently a member, please visit bgr.org to join the ranks of empowered citizens working to improve local government. We thank you for participating in this event and for staying engaged in public policy discussions important to our community. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your day.